Welcome to the Intrazone, a show about the Microsoft 365 Intelligent Intranet. I'm Mark Cashman here with my co-host Chris, the Premium McNulty.
Well, thank you, Admiral. If we're going to invent titles, I'll invent one for you.
I'll take Admiral. Salute.
Well, today we're chatting with Joanne Klein, who focuses on compliance across Microsoft 365. Joanne is the founder of Next Novus, which is an M365-focused consultancy. She's also a Microsoft MVP on the apps and services specialty. I've known Joanne for years, and she really brings tons of energy and her technical chops to educating our community as well as helping guide real-world implementations for our customers that blend collaboration and compliance.
So I grabbed a little time recently on site when Joanne and I were both at the 365 EduCon in Chicago to pull all this information that I think is going to be wonderful for our audience. Hearing her answers is the value to you, especially when it comes to records management and some of the tooling that either we provide or some of the things that she suggests so that you can get a sense of good lifecycle management, of course, her best practices that she would recommend, and how to get it right from the get-go. I do want to put a small plug note is when we recorded with Joanne, it was just before we announced SharePoint Premium. So when we talk about Microsoft Syntex, which is, of course, the rebrand, which I'm going to ask Chris just to give a few details here to set the context right. So we had just been planning to move to SharePoint Premium, but anytime that we talk with Joanne in the context of the conference, we were still referring to it as Syntex. But you should know all that value persists, and everything that Joanne mentions around Syntex, of course, is still a great best practice or a thing you should know.
I can put that in a little bit of context. Over the past year, there's been a couple of things that have been top of mind in the product team. First is, we've been, developing, and we say incubating Syntex, from our announcements a year ago up through now. And as different services have kind of come on market and started to be used, we're seeing just massive usage of those Syntex services across the board for document processing, for OCR, for content assembly, and more. And that's really given us kind of a moment to think through, how do we want to use marketing to explain technologies to customers? The last couple of years, I think anyone who's even a casual observer of us across the board at Microsoft, we've been introducing new capabilities, new ways of doing things, and new brands. And I think that pace of change in what's been, with the move to cloud, with the return to work, with the rise of AI, there's just so much going on. We want to also simplify that and make it easier for customers to plug into things. And so it's given us a lot of confidence to kind of look at existing and new brand structures. And, one of the things that we've really focused on is SharePoint. It's, despite kind of the size of it, Microsoft hasn't spoken about that core SharePoint capability over the last few years nearly as much as we probably should. For us, SharePoint really is our fundamental brand for content management. And we think that the success of Syntex really gives us, I think, the mandate to expand the range of capabilities that we've been delivering under the Syntex banner with things like SharePoint Advanced Management and Backup and Archive, and really, holistically fit things into and bring back to life, both that heart of SharePoint that powers M365, as well as our advanced services, which we're calling SharePoint Premium.
So just so you know, I did see proof that the Syntex brand is persisting, but I only say this in a joking fashion. But at an event yesterday, I saw our friend Brad Gussen, who is focused on a lot of what we're doing for Backup and Archive, and he had his Syntex jacket on. And I pointed to it and I said, that is going to be a legacy gem.
It takes a while for these changes to show up in product. So, the capabilities that you've heard of as Syntex, they'll continue to be branded as Syntex for a couple of months moving forward. The stuff we're doing, like with SharePoint Advanced Management, there's a lot that is coming that we announced at Ignite, and we probably should and could easily dedicate a full episode of the Intrazone just to unpacking SharePoint Premium. And so definitely look for that coming to a podcast near you soon.
So for today, Chris, because we're talking to Joanne, and you'll hear that soon, and that motion of moving Syntex to SharePoint Premium, I think there's just a little bit of a broader context to set up that I think will help anybody listening to this episode around, like you said, SharePoint represents content management. But step back from SharePoint and just talk about content management as a whole, where we know the spectrum from really one-to-one type collaboration in OneDrive to the team space to then things like document centers, records management, Microsoft Purview. Do you mind just giving a little lay of the land? You know, you're an expert in this area as well as Joanne. Something that gives just a little bit of broader context, and then when we get into the conversation, I think will make a little bit more sense for everyone.
Sure. So, around 25 years ago, at the time, the president and CEO of AIM, the Association for Intelligent Information Management, John Mancini is a recognized thought leader, and he coined the term enterprise content management to refer to all of those core services for storing and managing the lifecycle of mission critical documents. And in those days, that was almost entirely an on-premises environment. The cloud was really just in its nascent stage then. And if you look at the secular trends over the past 10 years, I think you've really seen where we were was you had what was called systems of record, where you had your official contracts and policies and decisions, and you had systems of engagement, which is how you communicated and collaborated, and never the twain shall meet. And one of the things that's happened is you've looked at, no matter what your governance says, if you say that official contracts should only be kept in one system, of course it's showing up in the collaboration space. And of course, people need to collaborate on those mission critical documents. And so you kind of, as we moved into the cloud, there's just better integration across the stack. And so, at its worst case, at its best case, ECM represented a set of principles for creating, managing, sustaining, and disposing of content with security and workflow throughout its life cycle. At its worst, it became a very expensive place to put documents that no one else could get to so they wouldn't be touched. And so, we've been breaking down the barriers amongst apps and, amongst those systems so that you can bring some of the discipline of content management into collaborative content and then use collaborative tools to work with those high value documents. And so, that ongoing trend about breaking down those barriers in storage, in usage is, one of the key things that we're mindful of. If you just take one of those core disciplines that goes back to the origins of ECM, like records management, records can happen anywhere. You can have records management in your authoritative contract management system. You may also have records that show up inside of your email or inside of Teams or inside of OneDrive. And so taking a much more thoughtful approach about having a range of services that can be integrated to solve not just management problems, but usage challenges. How do I make sure that the content isn't just being stared at by an admin to make sure it doesn't leave the building, but to make sure that the people who need access to it can get it? And that's really, I think coming full cycle when you look at things like Copilot. You're using Copilot, right, Mark?
I am. I've used it a number of times, once for fun, and then a couple times actually to help me, generate a couple of things that I was doing in Loop, and certainly in just some of the areas of the new document to page creation in SharePoint. Generative AI doesn't do a lot if it doesn't have kind of a basis to reason over. If you can imagine, if Copilot isn't connected to the internet and has no documents or communications to look at and to summarize, it's pretty dumb. It doesn't know anything. It only can act on the things that you give it. And so as we look at blurring the lines between systems of collaboration and systems of records management, we need to do it in a way so we know what is authoritative, that we've got the best structured and managed content so that the next wave, systems of intelligence are operating on a better baseline of information than would have been possible in the past. I think especially when you think about maybe perception of in the past on how these technologies worked or the common life cycle of where a piece of content lives for a period of time, and then maybe that changes over time depending on its status. But our model initially takes the approach of keeping things in place. That may not be true across how everybody can implement or prefer to implement, but we start there. And I thought it would be helpful for people to hear from you that model, maybe some of the benefits or differences. And when we think about some of our new offerings like Microsoft 365 Archive, and of course the breadth of offerings from our ecosystem in that space and how that might augment the ways that people configure, or at least think about, the ways that they can take advantage. Would you mind just polishing that up a little bit and explaining?
Yeah, I think the original pattern was, predates digital technologies. If you think about how a contract existed in the paper-only world, you would have meetings, you'd write memos, you'd write drafts, they'd kind of assemble in all these file folders. When you got a signed contract, that signed contract would then be moved to a special file room. Like these are the official approved patterns. And that persisted in the early days, kind of ECM technologies, that you would, when something was a record, you'd move it somewhere else. And other people who may have contributed might not have access to it anymore. That's really disruptive if you think about it. Because if you imagine Mark, if you and I are on a project with a couple of colleagues and we're going to work on a contract for an event, all of the inputs that we're collaborating on, the graphics, the abstracts, the decks and materials and spreadsheets for the financing, that all makes sense to live in a collaborative zone. And one of the artifacts that we're going to generate there is the contract for the event. And if that contract then moves someplace else, you and I and the rest of the folks in the team, we now have to, our mental map has to go to two places. We have to go for the context of all of our collaborative information. There's this one other document that now lives somewhere else. And so it's, one of the ways you break down that barrier is by thinking about records as not being a place, but a state. And once you say that, if this is a signed, approved thing, if this is the final version of the presentation, it makes sense to just keep it in the flow of work where it belongs, with the right security, because now, we've got fantastic security and management controls that extend throughout collaboration tools like Teams, like Outlook, like SharePoint. So that means that being able to do things in place makes a lot of sense for a time. And then if you think about the information lifecycle, that record is something you may want to keep for 10 years. The rest of the project, if we go back to, let's think of May 4th, 2016, that SharePoint day that we had in San Francisco all those years ago when we announced modern SharePoint, there's lots of things and artifacts that don't need to be kept around forever. It also is kind of weird to save a team site when it only has 2 documents left inside of it. So there's a point in time where it makes sense in kind of that information lifecycle management to say, after the collaboration is over, we're going to aggregate that information and put it somewhere else, just because the place where it has been living doesn't make sense anymore. My diploma lived in my dorm room at college for, a few more days, but then the dorm room went away. So I have to kind of move it to its permanent repository, whether it's on my wall or the top of the refrigerator or a box in my attic, but that's a persistent store. So being able to be flexible with that life cycle, there's always going to be a role for having collections of records. The nice thing is with technologies like metadata, like search, and with AI, you can find it and manage it wherever it needs to be. And so there's a lot of flexibility that goes into that. And I think, Mark, it also kind of overlays a little bit with archiving. Archiving and, records management are closely related, but they're not the same thing. Because I may want to move certain content later in its life cycle to archive, even if it isn't a mission critical piece of information. I want to clean up my information architecture. I also, may have things, they're records, but I don't want to move them somewhere else. I need to keep them handy. And so having flexibility to make sure that information is showing up in the best places it can, and whatever your information architecture needs to be, is really important, especially when you bring archiving in as a related technology.
I think it's that flexibility. I think our model puts it in a really good lens of, there are great ways to work with a lot of different types of content, and at all different points of it, you might want to have more options to continue to work with it than maybe you have in the past. You've gotten some of our thoughts around ECM, both historical and ways that we're promoting that in the service by default if you're investing or looking at it, sort of within the realms of Microsoft 365. But we're going to cut over and hear from Joanne, who really is going to give us a broader sense of the advanced state of compliance with IA in mind, with some of the tools we've been talking about, and really to hear from her some of the best practices that you should do so you get it right from the get-go, or you reorient yourself so that you can go forward in a way that makes sense for how you want to do business. So let's take time now to hear from Joanne Klein, live from the 365 EduCon, and here we go. All right, we are here on site in Chicago at 365 EduCon. And so you might hear a few things happening around us. I'm here with Joanne, and we are going to be talking about compliance. We're going to be talking about RM and lots of other things. IA, lots of acronyms. First, I wanted to say thank you for coming on the IntraZone. And if you wouldn't mind, just to give a sense of, for our audience, who is Joanne Klein and some of the things you've been focusing on here at the 365 EduCon.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Yes, I'm Joanne Klein, and I am here as a speaker, and I'm talking about what I do during my day job as an independent consultant working with customers in mostly Purview compliance, data lifecycle and records management, but also in Microsoft Syntex. So those two worlds are where I'm comfortable in, and they're fitting right in with the topic of the day here.
So you said the word syntax and you're comfortable with it, which means you can take some gnarly projects and probably simplify them for how people manage their content at scale better, with better visibility and control, and better tagging and all the things that comes with that. If we took what you focus on here at the show, which I think will be a lot of interest for people to hear about, is when you look at that in whatever level across either those two products or those two subject areas. If you were to start your talk and maybe the first 5 minutes you describe the state of compliance, the benefits of good IA approach and adhering to that once it's implemented, and anything about the products, what is kind of the first thing that you say as people are starting to learn about this and to ground the importance of taking it to heart when they're thinking about their content?
That is a great question. And one of the topics I like to address with customers is that information architecture in SharePoint is still important. I think there was a while where some customers were wondering or doubting if there was still value in having a well-governed SharePoint environment with good governance around information architecture. And I believe firmly the answer is absolutely yes. And I see evidence of that in Microsoft Syntex. Certainly, many of the constructs that they're leveraging are, long-standing SharePoint information architecture artifacts that have been around for years, even from the SharePoint on-prem days. So trying to make organizations comfortable that this is where you should be focusing, and your time spent there will be well spent based on the way these products are being built. On top of that is the compliance features. To be able to manage compliance, particularly I'll focus in on records management at scale across any environment. Unless you're going to rely on an end user to manually know to do the right thing and apply the right retention label on the right piece of content, you absolutely have to rely on automation and AI to scale that. And one of the main areas you can do that is a solid information architecture. So these two worlds collide in the middle, and you don't need Syntex per se to implement records management. It is one of the additional ways you can work with content that you have in your current business processes and maybe try to automate some of that information architecture. It's a very interesting conversation to have with customers and try to demonstrate to them, the possibilities that are there for them to be able to leverage information architecture still today.
Do you see a lot, and I don't even know if this is a really good question, but I think there's a component of ingesting content, whether it was on a separate server as part of migration or just ingesting from some process and eventually it gets digitized and it's an invoice, it's a this or to that, versus things that just organically live and start in the cloud by default, and where they land or where you start something will be indicative of the process that it follows, the tags that get, immediately extracted. And lots of other, things that then level what is good IA and good compliance so that then you have good automation that you can build off of that. I don't know, maybe it's a balance of, is it more ingest where a lot of this is focused, or the where and how you start natively in the cloud?
I would say it's a bit of both. Organizations are at different stages of the content that they have inside of SharePoint. So for those organizations that have the majority of their content in SharePoint, one of the first things I need to get in front of is how well governed or poorly governed is that SharePoint environment, because that is one of the contributing factors to the effort and complexity of any records management project. Is it Wild West? What kind of guardrails were put into place when you did that migration, if you have migrated already? Most of my customers that are reaching out to me, it is Wild West.
I just went from a file server and I put it all on the same site. You're like,
yes.
What?
Yeah. So, trying to tackle that beast, and there's a couple of different ways you can do that. We have to have the conversation. Are you going to kind of look at this from a net new perspective? And this is a very large project to try to wrap your head around. So kind of looking at it incrementally. Sometimes some organizations say, let's look at this from net new construction, and we'll put in the right guardrails as we're working with that, with some of maybe this migrating in from maybe a shared network drive, kind of digitalizing some of that content. That's where Syntex can help. Worked with a customer that has definitely done that with thousands of files that were sitting on a shared network drive in a really nice folder structure, but not really helping them too much. So in that case, they set up a new site and they were able to migrate that in and actually run a Syntex model on that. But more common, I would say, is trying to deal with the content that is out there, the Wild West, if you will. And how are you going to deal with that? Are you going to renovate what's out there? That can be challenging. Are you going to reconstruct? So it's new construction, renovation, and reconstruction. Reconstruction is we're going to create new sites and almost redo some of the migration and move things around in a better way. Because, compliance wasn't top of mind when we initially came into SharePoint. So having those conversations, and customers are at varying degrees of those different kind of areas, is where I spend an overwhelming majority of my time and my expertise.
When you paint the good outcomes in this space, and the Wild West, you want it to be less wild, and you want content to be well tagged and easy to discover. Yeah. What are some of the things that once they're in a good state that you would paint as the why we're doing this in the first place? It can't be just because I want to be more compliant. It can't be just because I want to move to the cloud. Right. What are some of the drivers that would be maybe scenarios or reasons to, like you said, take on a project, potentially spend a little bit more on a specific product?
Mm-hmm. I think organizations are well served to kind of identify some key business processes, either ones that are, for super important content that they may have in their organization. And every organization is going to have those 3 to 5 different types of content, super important, kind of focus in on them to get that ROI, or things that are, lots of people are involved. It's a very complicated, perhaps manual process, paper-based process today. Focus in on how can we help that, streamline that? What is the value of us doing that? Yes, compliance will be a byproduct, ideally, but at the end of the day, the whole reason behind having a business record is to provide value to the organization from legal, regulatory, or just from a business perspective. There's institutional knowledge in those business records, and identifying the areas across your organization where you really need to focus definitely helps.
The image, just as you were explaining, especially the adhering to process, means maybe in the past that the statement of I'm drowning in paperwork. Now you wouldn't want to drown in the digital archive or the whatever it is that there's so much value in if it's in the right place and it's discoverable and usable. But at the same time, if you don't adhere to something that can help you every time something X happens, and that's 1,000 times or millions of times, whatever the scale is, the drowning part is, by the end of the day, you should be, back to being back in the boat.
Right. To that point, one of the things I'm witnessing, I believe, is a modernization of the records management profession all up, both from a records manager perspective and from a regulator perspective. And I think that's because they're moving from a paper-based world, which there's still lots of paper out there, by the way, to a digital-based world where net new content, by and large, is digital. And some of the old paradigms that worked in the paper-based world simply do not scale in the digital world. So I'm seeing records managers and, as younger record managers come up, maybe they're teaching this in school. They have a bit, some fresh perspective, and maybe we don't have to do that. Let's focus on what's really important here. Being able to manage our records in a good way that's automated as much as we can. We can't. Perfection is the enemy of good sometimes on this, and the controls are pretty good, getting better every day, but some records managers would still like them to be better. So it's just trying to work through that with customers. I spend a good part of my time doing that as well.
I bet. And if you're talking to a records manager, somebody by title or that's just what they do, and whether it's old or, some folks that have been doing it for a while, I know a lot of what you focus on, reading some of the blurbs of your sessions here, is the data lifecycle. And when you're talking to somebody maybe that's a little bit green or maybe hasn't yet adhered to good process, if there's an element of purview, even for me just to understand a little bit of where that fits into this mold, the data lifecycle management of that, and then adhering to what you might then articulate as best practices. What are some of those gems that might come from you?
In order for me to really get down to the nut of how we can implement some of these retention controls in a scalable way that makes sense for an organization, education is always number one. Teach someone to fish. So I like to explain how the different retention controls work inside Microsoft Purview, how Microsoft has implemented them. There's kind of the catch-all type of retention, which scares many records managers. But it's a good model, in addition to having a very well laid out file plan with the correct automation in place. So you can't do one kind of without the other. And records managers and IT and SharePoint admins, you have to have the right skills brought to the table, which is another key thing in this area. It can't just be records managers. They each bring different required skills. You got to bring them together to implement kind of this holistic program with a combination of things coming from Purview. Yes.
So if we were to maybe dive into an example of from planning phase to implementation to then a good run state, maybe across multiple roles, without naming any names, if there's a customer scenario that lands a little bit of what it is they wanted to accomplish and maybe your approach to then how to get them to where to go. Is there anything that would be a real world scenario that you can share?
Sure. A global pharmaceutical company, as well as a federal company in Canada that's in the legal area. So I span different industry verticals, but to be honest with you, although they all might have to adhere to different regulations, the constructs behind the scenes are very repeatable and very familiar from one to the other, which is helpful in helping them with an approach. So I like to learn about their world. Kind of an education piece is definitely important. Then we get into discovery, so I can kind of assess, okay, how is their SharePoint information architecture? Where are they on a scale of 1 to 10? I get pretty specific on this, and it's helpful for the customer because they can see the effects of their if they have Wild West, of having that kind of an environment. So have recommendations on that. And then the complexity of the retention schedule, again, 1 to 10, that pretty much slots them on, this is where we're at, this is what we need to focus on. And based on that, we will do a deep dive on the retention schedule. We'll look at, okay, how does this impact your information architecture? What can we do here to improve it? Is there use cases for syntax, let's say? Like syntax, the processing models, you can use that for lots of use cases. You might not want to use that for every library across your whole tenancy. So there's a couple of different things that you might want to have at play. I always pick a representative sample from the retention schedule and work with them to configure it all, information architecture and syntax if that's part of it, and the Purview setup as a proof of concept, so they can see it up front. They get to see the impact that's going to have, not only on the technology front, but on the human resource front, the process front. It affects many, many things in an organization. And then we can start getting into a pilot scenario in their production environment. Ideally, some customers ask for recipes. I'm a little hesitant to use that word because that makes it, sound pretty
cookie cutter.
Pretty cookie cutter.
Here's how we do it.
Right.
You're no special sauce,
Right.
But in reality, everything you just described to me, even if it's a common approach, there are going to be some things that, that means this, that they told me. Oh, they've got
For
that.
sure.
Oh, they don't have
yes.
that. Oh, I need
to. Yeah. So recipe, kind of, but it needs to have some flexibility to it. But I understand the desire for having some guardrails around there and having a set of recipes to pick from and then change accordingly. And then, pilot stages, implementation, and all the organizational change management, corp communications that comes with this, which is significant on all of these things. So also making sure that the notion of a data steward or information steward is common in the records management industry. And in Microsoft, every time you provision a Microsoft team, you're basically giving somebody the role of a local information steward. They need to know what kind of business records they may store there. So it's kind of an informal data steward. The best results I see from organizations is they have a very well-defined training program for things like that. So all of those things, we kind of work together to build a good data governance program, basically.
Once you articulate the what they want, how they're going to do it, and this may be, per customer, they're going to have questions back to you as you go, not to just refine what your approach is with them, but them in a learning phase.
Yes.
And maybe even cheat a little bit since we're here at a conference where you're doing some of these talks. What are some of those common blocker concerns or perceptions that, I get it that, okay, that sounds like some work we have to do, and it sounds like a couple products we need to review, but is there anything that's either product oriented or process oriented where it's more perception? I get what I want to do, but I don't know if I need anything specific, or I've heard this and we don't want to do it because, something as a perception would be a blocker?
I'm not sure this is quite answering your question, but it's on the skirt tails of it. So I will say, if I ask a records manager, and I'm kind of picking on them because that's my main compliance partner when I'm working with my projects, is if I were to ask them, how automated would you like things to be? The answer 99 times out of 100 will be as automated as possible. I mean, that's probably what I would answer as well. The net effect of that answer, though, or the repercussions of that request and that requirement, has a very big impact on IT and on SharePoint. And they may not realize that. So that's why I always want to have those three teams at a minimum on the technology front to be working together so that, we're like data governance is it can be a bit nuanced on how automated do you need things to be. So I like organizations to kind of declare where they are at on that scale. It may move over time, but you can't have everything absolutely automated on day one. As good as automation is and as well governed as your environment is, that's to me not attainable, even for small SMBs, small businesses. So kind of identifying, we're good at, at this kind of level of automation. We acknowledge not everything is going to be perfect. We're going to try to put in as many controls as possible to mitigate that risk, but we're writing it in policy. This is kind of where we stand today. So that is often what organizations do to try to meet the spirit of the regulation that has been given to them and, write kind of in policy why they may not to be 100% compliant with that. And typically that does satisfy a regulator.
Some of what you've described, both in process automation and a little bit of stepping back in a few of the things that you were covering earlier, I got a sense that you were describing to me something like a compliance maturity model. Where are you and how are we going to get you in stages? Not all at once. Yes. There's the other side of it is just the reality of change management. Mm-hmm. Things that we do in the service change, new features, changes in general. How do you get to an end of a project where they're in a good new state and describe the next state that they might want to achieve and what they actually need to do besides the records management side of itself to think about when technology changes or when we're going to take on a new project to reach the next level? What does that conversation look like? It's sort of like a second conversation that you get, or a third or a fourth. I know you probably work ongoing.
Right. I think there needs to be established processes where perhaps none existed before on, okay, we have a new business process that we're starting, building that compliance in from the beginning. It is exceedingly more difficult to build it in after the fact than it is to consider it in the beginning. And there's so many good tools across Microsoft 365 to help automate and streamline many business processes. So fine-tuning that process, not just, doing things kind of the way you always did them and dumping a bunch of files in a team because, that's the way you've always done it and it's quickest. Like having more maturity on those kinds of things from the governance, risk, and compliance perspective, but as well from the SharePoint information architecture perspective, since those two worlds are together. Mm. And of course, having a very mature provisioning process. It's a non-negotiable for areas that I work in. That's kind of the first thing I say to start doing. So just working on that over time and just making sure it's doing all of the right things post-implementation as well.
Internally, I see it. I don't know if this is directly related to what you're working on, but from a site creation perspective, if I create a site that I need internally, there's a process behind it, but it's mostly self-service for most of what I do. Yeah. But there is still a lifecycle management to the site. Do you still need it?
Yes.
You have these people in it. Yeah. Do they still need access? Mm-hmm. So I get a lot of those email nags and, then I can take an action. Yeah. Usually it's yes or no and it's, done. Yeah. There's also the other side of the group that I'm managing. Do you still need this Microsoft 365 group? I don't know how much that comes into play with access, and I'm sure it's a lot of the governance plan, mm-hmm. but it's also just a part where it's more just me re-upping. Yep, I still need it. Or if I don't need it, they've at least set a life cycle too where it's going to eventually, be removed and deleted.
Yes. This is all under the broad heading of employee training and helping them be your good compliance partners across your organization. The life cycle of a group or a site is a perfect example of that, or a team. Yeah, so put that into your onboarding process, have maybe quarterly, annual attestations of this is what it means to be compliant, and if you are a group owner, these are your responsibilities. So you're expecting this email whenever you get it that, yes, you have to say if you still need it or not. So those kinds of things, really important to just embed into your company culture right across the board.
Yeah, that it is, of course, automated. I know nobody's checking every Friday,
Right.
Like, is Mark compliant, or does he still need what he needs? And if he doesn't, let's, cleanse that, and fewer things, sometimes easier to manage.
Yes.
I wanted to blend a little bit into learning more about who you are when I was doing my research. Where I at least found one thing that I saw it seemed like of interest was something that I'm as well. But I also just want to know, during these times when we are now, I think maybe working from home more or having a little bit of different time, I saw that you were a fellow paddler. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that was a stand-up paddle or kayaking. I throw my hand up and say I love to kayak every once in a while. But, just to learn a little bit more about what you found besides work when you finish the project and the customer's finally compliant. Whew. What does Joanne like to turn to? Are you still paddling?
In the summer months, of course, yes. I live in Western Canada, so that is definitely a season activity for me. So yeah, paddling, stand-up paddleboard, kayak, and of course a Garmin canoe. So all of the above. I just like non-motorized water toys. So yeah, I love that. And it's great exercise as well. Yeah. So working from home, another kind of thing during the other part of the year when it's not paddle worthy is I have an outdoor cedar sauna. It actually looks like a hobbit house. It's quite cute. It's like a barrel. What the Finns have discovered is really a good way of just relaxing at the end of a day and just letting all the stress go.
I was going to say, I think we have a peer who is a Microsoft peer, but I believe you work with him quite often, Vesa Juvonen.
Yes.
Who is a Finn, about as much Finn as I can think a Finn is. And I believe the sauna is a staple.
Mm-hmm. It is a staple.
Which is, I think you're right. We should incorporate more of the international experience. Canada, it's not too far of a stretch to reach over and good. Well, I am trying to get back into the paddling mode. It's been a little while, but getting out on the water for me is about the most relaxing thing, especially when, you may have your phone to take pictures, but just no computer screens,
phone.
Full HD is what I like to think about. It's like getting out there.
Yeah.
Well, to just wrap up, if we're exiting the 365 EduCon soon and getting back into the world, what is just that sort of, don't forget, session's over, you're heading out and hop in the plane, and maybe there's that last little tidbit that you wanted to share. What's kind of the last thing that you would at the end of a workshop or the end of the session that you would, don't forget, keep this in mind. What is that last thing?
I would say don't let all of this overwhelm you. It can be very overwhelming when you think of, you have already millions of files. Let's say I heard an attendee say that the other day. I mean, these are big problems to figure out. So just educate yourself, like attending conferences like this. I mean, education is the best tool around. Learn how the tech works, understand your organization and the culture of it, and be willing to kind of be bold and challenge some traditional kind of approaches and maybe frameworks that have been used in your organization, and step back and really challenge why maybe you've always done something the way you've done it. Because it is possible, trust me, but it does require some work and dedication and just digging in at the end of the day.
All right. Dedication, dig in, learn.
Yes.
So thank you for everything that you do, obviously, here at the show, when you're paddling on the water and thinking about your next compliance. Oh, I got this idea. Or hopefully you don't think about it when you're paddling or in the sauna. But definitely thank you for being on the IntraZone.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
So up next on the IntraZone, it's time to take a focus on events. So this is a place where we look at the upcoming schedule of places where Microsoft and our community are gathering, whether it's online or obviously we are way well into the return to gathering thousands of people, at a single place to celebrate and learn about a particular technology. So before we look forward, Mark, we should probably chat a little bit about Microsoft Ignite, which was held just a few weeks ago here in Seattle. What did you think of Ignite this year?
I thought it was good. I mostly was online. I was kind of taking it in from afar. I had, of course, worked on a number of things in prep or review with a number of people that were presenting, promoting a lot of what it is that we were doing with SharePoint. We did the SharePoint pre-event guide that now persists and has a lot of updated content that you also contributed to. So we've got a lot of on-demand video content. But I thought on the whole, on-site looked really active. I'd love to get your perspective. Online, very active. And a lot of the content that came through was a lot of news and a lot of things to catch up on.
If you don't know what Copilot is, you weren't at Ignite. I'll say that. I thought it was great. To be able to get thousands of people back at an event. I know we made some tentative steps towards it a year ago, but, this, I felt like we were, truly back with live keynotes, live breakouts, hands-on labs, expo hall that we didn't call an expo hall, but we had, lots of booths from product teams and from partners where you could go in and ask experts and meet things. Tremendous energy, big crowds there, opportunities for networking. It was good to be back. It felt like it was over all too quickly, but I would just love being able to get kind of that live energy from the various sessions that, that my team supported, that we all supported. And, I look forward, I think it gives us a good springboard to be able to do, I think, even more when we think about some of the events that are upcoming. I think it bodes well for the future of having that vibrant community show up at all these events.
Yeah, I thought we definitely took hybrid to another level again, but this one seemed to be more engaging than last year with some of the feedback we got. So I think that was addressed. And again, all the content that's now available on demand, it's easy to access, not too many hoops to jump through, especially if you go to the Ignite YouTube channel. It's all there, even segmented out as far as smaller chunks if you want to consume portions. But yeah, I thought it was really great. It was also just fun to see you on stage with Jeff. Again, me kind of in attendee mode. So it was really fun to see you all do your thing and of course help amplify some of that with some of the behind the scenes images you were sending me.
Yeah, and it's one of the things we, backstage, we had to be mindful for every person we were speaking to live in the room. We thank everyone for making the trip. There were, 10, 20, 30 people who were watching remotely. So that was just, great. And it, I think moving forward, treating these things as a hybrid event lets us, A, collect the community that can collect, and B, engage the people who are, going to be at some distance or have some scheduling impossibilities, but still making sure we can bring the maximum number of people together to learn and grow.
So Ignite is in the books. You can get it all on demand. Just go to ignite.microsoft.com, or like I mentioned, a lot of the content is on the Microsoft Ignite YouTube channel. But looking a little bit forward, this is into 2024, beyond Ignite, beyond a lot of the end of year events that we've been talking about. We have a few that we want to highlight that are coming soon in 2024. The first one is Teams Nation 2024. This is on February 21st, and this is put on by some of the MVPs that you might know, Chris Horde, Chirag Patel and team. And you can find more information. We'll have links. Right now, it's still kind of in an early phase as far as the site is concerned, but you can find information under the hashtag Teams Nation if you're on Twitter, or just go seeking through and you'll find information that Chris and Chirag and team are putting out there. But if you want to learn about the state of Microsoft Teams, go to Teams Nation 2024 in February on the 21st.
Also coming up in 2024, the NCAA College Football Playoff featuring local bright spot, the Washington Huskies, undefeated Pac-12 championships. I had to throw in a gratuitous sports reference. Many of you will be shocked that it does not reference a New England team.
I don't know. It could mean something. You're starting to assimilate to the Pacific Northwest, I think.
I have family at UW, so, and I'll just leave that one there. But yeah, it's obviously not a Microsoft event. But one thing that is a Microsoft event is the first time ever Microsoft Fabric Community Conference. It's coming up in late March, 26th to 28th in Las Vegas. It's a chance to learn at depth about all of our data analysis and delivery solutions with data movement, data science, looking at business intelligence. it's a superset of all the things that historically we've orchestrated around Power BI. So this is a place to come and learn about all things that come together with data analytics. The Fabric Community Conference. It will not be any quilting there, I can promise.
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if our friend Jason has anything to do with it. He's got some fun swag ideas I was hearing about. But to round out 2024 and also to round out this episode and not dwell too much on too many events that are a little bit far from now, we thought we'd give you kind of a broader peek at 2024, starting with the AIM conference that Chris referenced from 2023. There will be another one in 2024 in San Antonio. Then there's the North American Collaboration Summit in Dallas, the Microsoft 365 conference in Orlando, the SharePoint Intranet Festival that's online, the European Collaboration Summit in Germany, the 365 EduCon in Seattle, and more throughout 2024. We'll provide a lot of information and dates when we get into 2024 with some of our first episodes. We'll crank out all this event information, kicking off episodes as you would expect with event information in the new year. But until then, if you have an event, Chris, that we don't know about,
please let us know. We love amplifying all the work that's happening across the community. We would love to spotlight your event, whether we've talked about it or not, on an upcoming episode of The Intro Zone.
We want to thank our guest, Joanne Klein, for being on the show and for sharing all things RM, compliance, and Purview.
We'll encourage you to check out our show page for links to everything we talked about today and more. Visit us at aka.ms/theintrozone.
You can also send us your questions and thoughts on the University of Washington football team or any feedback for the SharePoint OneDrive and all the teams that we connect to. You can reach us via email at theintrozone@microsoft.com or via Twitter at SharePoint, at Joanne C. Klein, at M. Cashman, and C. McNulty 2000.
Remember to rate, review, and tell all your friends about the show. Follow the show in the completely empty alumni stadium of Boston College. Once again, BC does not make the college football playoff, but you can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts.
We thank you for staying compliant and listening. I'm your host, Mark Cashman. This has been The Intro Zone, a show about the Microsoft 365 rights-managed intelligent intranet.